The least understood and the least utilized skill in photography is tone. I learned that about 15 years ago from the late great Ken Whitmire. Accepting this truth about photography and deciding that I was going to resolve it really shaped my photographic career and studies, and ultimately my workshops, and eventually led me to discover the concept of shadow hacking that I teach so often here on the channel and in my Shadow Hackers workshops. But today I'm not going to tell, I'm going to show you 3 examples of how this works practically, and the 3 keys that allow us to understand and utilize tone correctly. The first is that shadows create contrast. The second is that contrast reveals tone. And the third is that tone creates atmosphere. It creates ambience, and ultimately it's what brings the emotion into our photos. You would think that since we're working with light and shadow, tone is a given, but we actually don't think about it near as much as we should. The first thing I'm going to do is show you 3 photos, all taken on the same street in San Juan del Rio, Mexico that I pass frequently. We're going to look at some portraits in a minute, but I want to start simple. The streets are in shadow. You see the line of the sun. We've created a contrast between the shadows and the brightness of the sunlight. Of course, there's a difference in warmth here, so one has a cooler and one has a warmer feel. Now, before you say, duh, Captain Obvious, shadows create contrast, really stop and think about it, because photographers don't actually use shadow to create contrast. We think of contrast as it's a contrasty lens. I'm using a contrast slider. I'm pushing blacks. I'm pushing whites. I'm making curves with contrast. Yes, these are ways to edit contrast, but they're not actually what gives us the contrast. So this first photo, late afternoon, edited with a natural HDR preset. Nothing crazy or spectacular, just a view of this street. Let's look at the next photo in this sequence of the very same street. This is taken early morning in the fog. It's edited with a silver 5 preset. There's grain, there's texture, and I'm using the mistiness and the shadowiness to create atmosphere. So we still have contrast, even though if you look at the histogram, we're not clipping blacks. The blacks kind of have this lifty look, but they seem very black next to the white foggy mists. Contrast, as we study in shadow hacking, is actually controlled by the tones that surround. That is to say, because I have so much shadowy here, and then we have these lighter mists, we actually have a lot of usage of the zones, going from about zone 1 to zone 9 in this, and we have a lot of contrast. But it's not contrast in the way we tend to think digitally. Micro contrast, blacks, white. Let's go to the silver 5 presets and look at how different blends of black and white affect this differently. And each one of these does a completely different look. You can see this has a lot more clarity and texture, dehaze happening. There's more micro contrast. See, all these sliders, even sharpening, they're all just different levels of creating contrast on a wider set of pixels or a narrower set of pixels. And each of the apps we use, whether you're in Lightroom or Capture One or Photoshop or something else, are just algorithms that are manipulating this on a different level. So what do we have? Our first was that shadows create contrast. We've done that. The second is that contrast reveals tone. We see the nuances, even in this black and white, of grays, blacks, and white. The way the contrast is gradual or harsh affects the intensity and the way we visualize the tone. I'll show you another example of that in a minute with a portrait. Tone is the nuance of the shadow, the highlights, and everything we're working on here. It's the overarching umbrella of all of this. Let's look at the next photo, again taken at sunrise, but on a clear day. This one edited very warm with a gold chrome preset to really bring out the warmth of that morning sunrise. Again, we have all of these things coming into play. The shadows, like the blacks in this trees, are creating contrast in the way we see the sunlight shooting up the road. The contrast is revealing the different tones. This is color, it's very warm. It almost feels monotone. The third comes into play here, and that is the tone creates atmosphere. The amount of contrast, the intentional use of the lens flaring coming in from this side is creating actually reduced contrast in the sense of the contrast we know, the slider. By letting that flare kind of mist in, it's affecting the way the contrast rolls off. This gives us this overarching tonality that has a warm softness to it, even though we do have rich shadows over here. And ultimately that tone, the mixing of the contrast, the overall tone of color, and the flaring coming from that lens and the tone it creates is giving us atmosphere. We're actually taking away contrast in this image to build the atmosphere. But it doesn't mean we're not utilizing contrast. It doesn't mean we're not utilizing shadows. It doesn't mean we're not thinking overall about the overarching tones of our image. When you combine these three concepts of shadow, tone, and atmosphere, you get the ability to not just think technically in an image, but to merge the technical things like our exposure, how our lenses respond to flares, angles of the sun, sometimes moving back and forth just an inch or two to get those exactly the way we want it. It takes our images from sterile to atmospheric. Here's a portrait here taken at the magic hour. We have a little bit of strobe in the front. There's kind of the river here. There's pollen and insects and things like that. And this one is pretty contrasty. It's shot on a 90mm f2, a modern lens, and it looks good. It's a good portrait. This one here is taken at the same time of day, the same subject, very similar conditions, but we changed the angle to the other side of the tree and intentionally positioned the camera so that the light is kind of diffracting off the lens. It's actually reducing our contrast in camera. Now you could say, well, why not just reduce contrast in post? Let's go back to this image and just pull the contrast slider down. Now we get less contrast, but we get is a very flat image. We're taking away blacks and pulling down whites and kind of moving that histogram just toward the midtone. We're not actually creating real rich contrast or even just reducing it. This is an algorithm, and while our sliders can be very useful, it's really important to understand how to use contrast organically. Then when you combine that with our presets and filters and actions and all the things we use, the magic really comes out. Both of these were edited with the same Filmus preset to get a nice, soft, organic look, but one of them has a lot of ambience and kind of roll off. You can see this kind of hazy mistiness going on here. And again, this is not a hazy mistiness just created by pulling down the dehaze slider. Sliders are algorithms. They don't actually understand tone. But when we understand and utilize tone, starting in camera and carrying through to post-production, everything goes crazy. Now we can take all three of these elements further in post. We can use masks, we can burn and dodge, we can use tools like Lumist to select zones in Photoshop and edit and control those values. We can also go further and do ambience effects. That is to say, I can take an image like this portrait here, and I actually went in and did a softening ambience effect to really let the highlights bloom and let the shadows kind of have this lifted look using a new complex Photoshop action I'm working on that's inspired by David Hamilton's soft portraits from the 80s. At the same time, all these principles apply equally in an image that's taken with a sharp lens and that's just balanced. Shadows here are creating contrast, especially the deep shadows of this burnt out tree on our model, making her pop out. We see separation between the tones and the colors of the tree bark and the soft greens behind. Ultimately, all these tonal elements together, the dark line in the center and then the elements around that allow our eye to kind of dance around the scene, but ultimately come back to the model. So while we can use the principles of zones and exposure and all of these things, there's really no rule of how we use the shadows to create the contrast, how we use the contrast to reveal the tone, and ultimately allowing that tone to create atmosphere. How we do that is up to us as well. And you can also change that in post. but it starts in camera. Let's take that same image we just looked at and go to Photoshop, and I just ran that action I was just telling you about, and you can see this, that we're lifting blacks, we're warming up, we're doing a lot of softening and details, but come in here and look, there's grain, there's softening, there's detail. The contrast values have changed a bit. They're not as stark, and yet the distinction of our model from our background and the nuances and the tones of our subject haven't really changed. We've just used those in a different way to, in this case, create a softer, warmer atmosphere. Sometimes you do this with a vintage lens. Sometimes you do it by moving the sun so it's peeking through a branch or through someone's hair, or bouncing it a little bit off your lens. These are the little nuances that we do in camera, and knowing our technical things in camera helps us to not stress when we're on a shoot, so that we can actually play with those more artistic details of tone and utilize it better. Then when we go to post, it takes everything to the next level, because we're taking a good image in camera, a great image in camera, we're making it phenomenal in post. If you take a mediocre image in camera, you can post process it to death and it might improve it, but it's never going to be great. Tone is the least utilized and least understood factor in photography. And we talk about the nuances of it a lot on this channel, with a lot of emphasis on ultimately where that understanding led me, which is shadow hacking. If you guys found this useful, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and make sure you come to one of my Shadow Hackers live courses. I will put a link down below in the comments for a free ticket to my next upcoming workshop, where we actually dig into the overarching concept of shadow hacking. We'll see you there. Hope you enjoyed, and go put that tone to work.